245 kilometers an hour on test. At that speed, it would take less than 20 minutes to reach Johannesburg from Pretoria. It's certainly a far cry from that day 100 years or so ago, when President Paul Kruger paid his first visit to the burgeoning and boisterous mining town of Johannesburg. It took him exactly 5 hours to get there. There was no railway then, of course, so the old man had to make the long and tiring journey by coach. But as he bumped and swayed along the dusty track, strangely enough, a railway was in fact something he had very much in mind. So we'd better go back to the beginning, to an October day nearly a century and a half ago, when 13-year-old Paul and his parents were trekking out of the Cape, and the epic stand at Blood River was still 9 weeks away.
On that October morning in 1838, when the good citizens of Cape Town opened their local newspaper, they were startled at what they read. There was talk, the paper said, of building a railway at the Cape. Now, in those days, the idea of traveling by train was as remote as a journey to the moon, because it wasn't 9 years since George Stephenson's rocket had signaled that the world would never be quite the same again. But actually what the colony needed in those days was not so much a railway as a system of good roads, because encircled as it was by these forbidding mountains on one side, two great oceans on the other, it might as well have been an island.
And as one year melted into another, the feet of struggling beasts trod a primitive wagon road up the forbidding kloof. The highway in the sky, they called it. But it was a way out of the coastal plain, and for the next 100 years or so, the only one there was. Yet for those hardy souls who'd ventured beyond the encircling mountains, the outlook was bleak indeed. Even when they reached the plain, things were little better. What should have been a simple business of getting from one side of the Cape Flats to the other was fraught with such peril that wagon after wagon became bogged down in a morass of sand.
At last, towards the end of the 1840s, there came a change. And with that change, we find emerging the great names to herald the golden age of road building. Names like Montague and Mitchell, Andrew and Thomas Bale, piercing one mountain barrier after another, bursting out of the shackles of centuries, to emerge at last on that great plateau we call the Karoo.
By this time, the little dorps like Wynberg were growing up, and further afield, around Paarl and Wellington, farmers found themselves with wine and grain to spare. Lumbering old wagons that had carried them to market in Cape Town for all those years were now too slow, and the road across the flats was once again a sea of sand. If only the colony had been blessed with a navigable river like the Mississippi, how very different things might have been.
South Africa, of course, had no navigable rivers, so the question of a railway, which had been simmering away in the background all those years, suddenly now bubbled to the surface. And on a famous day in 1857, the governor, who was Sir George Grey, the governor was instructed to go ahead with plans for the construction of a line to Wellington. Enter now William George Browninger. Now, he'd been sent out from London by a group calling itself the Cape Town Railway and Dock Company to survey the proposed line. He was 37 years of age when he stepped ashore in 1857. A man of vast experience, he'd distinguished himself from the London to Birmingham Railway, and he'd been responsible for a lot of the construction of the Crystal Palace. Well, he lost no time in starting his survey, and the upshot was that his firm in London was awarded the contract, and that was to build a railway line from Cape Town to Wellington, passing through Stellenbosch and Paarl, a distance of about 72 kilometers. It was to be built to the British standard gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches, which is 143.5 centimeters. And incidentally, that was the width of the ruts left in the Roman roads in England and in Europe by the Roman military carts. Now, the contractor's name was Pickering, and he was given about 2.5 years to complete the line of 72 kilometers.
The first thing they did was to launch the line with all the panoply of a royal occasion. On one of the wettest days of the year, the governor and about 6,000 others arrived for the ceremony. In spite of the pouring rain, Sir George dutifully dug up a sod with his silver spade, and then, as 21 guns thundered their salute, he tipped it into a wheelbarrow and trundled it past the cheering crowds.
When Pickering was ready to start work, he soon found that the local labour was hopelessly inefficient. So he decided to bring out from England some 300 navvies to do the heavy construction work. And what a tough bunch they were. And what's more, they even dressed the part. Whacking great boots, thick soles with metal caps. The trousers, Rirel brown moleskin, tied with string below the knees. In winter, they wore a sort of a pea jacket. In summer, they worked stripped to the waist. And how they could work, the genuine ones, that is. But their ability to work was only matched by their ability to drink. Sink their own weight in booze. That's the story that used to go around in those days. On a windy afternoon in the spring of 1859, a ship had sailed into Table Bay. She was the brig Charles, and on board was something that to the people of Cape Town must have seemed as mysterious as something from outer space. It was a dismantled railway locomotive, and with it came the man who was to assemble it and to drive it. His name was William Dabbs, South Africa's first engine driver. This is what the engine looked like. In fact, this was the actual engine, built by his employers in Scotland all those years ago, and taken apart, shipped out to the Cape, and then reassembled by Dabbs down in the docks on wooden rails, and then trundled through the streets of Cape Town to what was known as the Grand Parade. Now, those early years must have been very unhappy ones for all concerned, because there seemed to be constant squabbling between Pickering and the company. You see, he was getting further and further behind in his work. In fact, he'd used up most of his contract time in laying the first 3 kilometers of track. Then came a nasty squabble over money. The upshot was that Pickering downed tools and fired most of his navvies. The company retaliated by saying that they would take over the plant and finish the job with Brownger in charge. Well, things came to a head when Pickering threatened one of the company's officials with a revolver. And this led to a free-for-all between the company's navvies and those still loyal to Pickering. And Pickering's gang then went on the rampage and tore up sleepers and track and built barricades and derailed one of the company's locomotives. And to crown it all, they then raided a canteen, drank themselves into a stupor. Well, obviously, Pickering had to go. And with him out of the way, Brownger was able to press on, and on the 13th of February, 1862, his line was opened to Eerste River.
Then it was Stellenbosch's turn. One year later, Brownger had a train steaming into Paarl.
Now, this train business upset many of the people in Paarl. They took a very gloomy view of a railway actually passing through their town. The ringleader, if you can call him that, was the local dominie, and he looked on the railway as the work of the devil. And when he discovered that the train would pass through the town on the Sabbath, he more or less blew his top. On the very first Sunday that a train came snorting and puffing into Paarl, the dominie happened to be in the middle of his sermon. He stopped, pounded the pulpit, said he couldn't hear himself think. This work of the devil must cease. So he and a group of townsfolk hit on the idea of forming an omnibus company to put the railway out of business. They called it the Paarl Omnibus Company, and it ran a daily service from Paarl to Cape Town. But the joke of it is that they ran their coach on a Sunday as well. But in the end, the railways lost so much business that they stopped running a Sunday train into Waar.
Despite all the hold-ups, Brownja pushed ahead. And shortly after midday on the 4th of November 1863, 4 years after construction had started, a flag-bedecked train with the governor on board and a host of VIPs and driver Dabbs proudly at the controls puffed into Wellington Station. Brownja's line had reached its journey's end at last. As the locomotive came to a stop, there was a loud cheer. Staid townsfolk threw their top hats in the air with great abandon.
After all that, the railway picture more or less lapsed into a state of hibernation. Admittedly, there were some far-sighted people who dreamt of the extension of the railway further inland, perhaps to Worcester, perhaps even further. But when they contemplated the sheer physical challenge of conquering that mountain barrier, they just shook their heads. Things might have stayed like that for another 100 years, perhaps, except that something happened. And that something was the discovery of diamonds.
That chance discovery on the banks of the Waar River was to change everything, for it heralded the greatest diamond rush of all time. So from that moment onwards, all eyes were turned on Kimberley here, and none gazed more hungrily than the people of Cape Town. But others were staring too, for Port Elizabeth and East London were far closer to Kimberley than Cape Town, and they had ports to handle heavy traffic. Meanwhile, the demands for any form of transport to the diggings burst on the Cape Colony like a bomb. And so from Cape Town and Port Elizabeth and East London, the wagons and carts and coaches rolled inland in one long, unending stream.
From Cape Town, passengers could take the train as far as Wellington, and from there, a passenger coach, 9 inside and 2 outside. And travelling sometimes night and day, they might reach Kimberley in 12 weary days. But considering the rewards to be gleaned, to be reaped by pushing the railways ahead with all possible speed, nothing was done about it. Meanwhile, every farmer with a span of oxen and a wagon to his name became a transport rider. Now, no wonder they regarded the mountains as a sort of insurance, because as long as the railways failed to cross them, their fortunes were assured. Then in 1872, 6 years after that first flush at Kimberley, something happened that was to shake the complacency of the colonists. The Cape Colony was granted responsible government, and then things began to happen.
The colony's first Prime Minister was Sir John Maltino. He was a man of great vision, and in Parliament he outlined a plan for a network of lines converging on Kimberley from Cape Town and Port Elizabeth and East London. The first terminus on the main line would be Beaufort West, more or less halfway to Kimberley. By having railways, he insisted, we'd benefit our neighbours also.
It was a staggering scheme. I mean, imagine in those days, more than 1,200 kilometres of new track costing the equivalent of 10 million rands. Well, the first thing he did was to borrow against the security of the colonial revenue. Then he bought that private line from Cape Town to Wellington, gave the green light for the extension to Worcester. That's how the Cape Government Railways was born. But that age-old problem of crossing the mountains just wouldn't be wished away. Would a suitable route ever be found? Well, there's only one way to find out. Go and have a jolly good look. And that's what he did. He sent a man with much experience. His name was Thomas Hall.
He was no longer young, but what he lacked in youth he made up in enthusiasm. For weeks he scrambled up and down the mountains and tramped through the valleys.
Then eventually he emerged and declared that he'd found a route along the valley of the Great Berg River and then over the ancient pass of Rudesand near Tollach. After that, he proposed to follow another valley, the Breda Valley, all the way to Worcester. Well, it was a long way round, and there was a problem. You see, because of the many steep curves involved, Hall wanted to reduce the standard gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches to 2 feet 6 inches. That's just over 70 centimeters. Well, Parliament was horrified because it would have meant scrapping the existing track. So they called in Browninger. He was the colonial engineer by this time. They called in Browninger to arbitrate. And he sat down and he thought about the problem. And he came up with his decision. Let's split the difference, he said. Let's make it 3 feet 6 inches. So 3 feet 6 inches, that's 106.5 centimeters it was to be, and 106.5 centimeters it is to this day. Now, as far as the existing track was concerned, well, that was quite easy. As a temporary measure, they could just lay an extra rail inside the existing lines. By this time, of course, the line was well on the way to Worcester, but the great challenge lay ahead.
It was this, the Hex mountain range, at once forbidding and defiant. On winter nights, when the moonlight glistens on the snow, people will tell you that the Hex, or witch, is abroad, roaming the mountaintops, searching for her loved one who fell to his death up there long, long ago.
Could Browninger throw a spur of steel over a barrier considered invincible? Well, it's quite a story, and this is how it began. He had a young field engineer working with him. His name was Wells Hood. One day he sent him a note. Examine the country, he told him, and come up with the shortest and best route from an engineering point of view. So Wells Hood and his assistant took off. And for a month, they traipsed up cliffs, and they tramped along valleys, and they forded rivers, and they crested mountains. And at the end, he sent in this report. I have found a route, he said, that I may say gives every facility for a cheap railway.
They'd found a route at last. The path that Browninger followed is the one we use today, to the railhead at Worcester. He drove his track up the Hex River Valley, zigzagging as he went. He drove tunnels through mountain spurs, and he built bridges over ravines. He built so many curves that if he were to join them all together, the train would have to travel 16 complete circles before it reached the summit. And to prevent friction on those steep curves, they had to grease the rails, and what's more, they still do. Even today, we still marvel at what Browninger did. In a distance of less than 80 kilometers, he lifted the line from Worcester here to an altitude of nearly 1,000 meters to bridge the Hex River Mountains.
There were no bulldozers in those days, or grabs, or graders, or any earth-moving equipment. All he was left with was these. But whose? In the early days, he'd approached the local farmers, but they were doing very well on a bounty on jackals, 15 shillings a brush, so they weren't interested in taking up manual work. So in the end became the formula as before, British navvies. But this time he brought out 2,000 of them. No one could match them in pick and shovel work. And as we've seen before, when it came to drinking, it was very hard to find their equals.
Now there stretched before them a vast plateau, a wilderness, the Karoo. We call it the Thirst Land, where summer lies like a red-hot breath. The first people of Africa called it the land without water, a dry ocean where dinosaurs 200 million years ago once ruled the ancient swamps. To the navvies, conditioned to the green fields of home, it must have seemed as if they'd landed on the moon. Everywhere they looked, the vast panorama of desert reached out to all eternity, and the sense of isolation both shattered and dismayed them. And yet, now that they'd reached the flat Karoo, they were able to forge ahead.
Just as in summer, the heat would set the steel afire, so in winter the ice-cold metal would strip the skin from any careless fingers. But above all, it was the loneliness that ravaged their very souls. But there was an answer to the loneliness, and that was brandy. You see, they weren't very far from the coach and wagon road, and the drivers would bring up brandy in barrels, and if the navvies had any pennies in their pockets, they'd buy the stuff. Otherwise, they'd just take it just the same. When supplies ran out, there was the problem. They used to roam the countryside in gangs, and nobody was safe. They'd raid coloured and Hottentot settlements, and even the Boer farmhouses were not immune from their plundering fingers. But if no brandy was forthcoming, well, they wouldn't think twice about smashing the farmers' windows or even molesting their womenfolk.
And so the ribbon of steel swept on through days of blistering sun and biting cold. Maikiersfontein, Langsberg, Grootfontein, Prince Albert, Fraserburg, with only a few corrugated iron stations to signal its progress, and where sudden floods often swept away weeks and weeks of toil.
And then, on a scorching February day in the year 1880, 3 trains steamed into the tiny oasis of Beaufort West. In the first train was the governor, and in the second were the great road builder Thomas Bain and his daughters. But for the men slogging away ahead of Beaufort West, all that was behind them. Ahead, the glittering diamond fields were beckoning, and they pressed on, Nelspruit, Victoria West, until one November day in 1883, the tracks came to a halt on a wind-swept farm some 260 kilometers beyond Beaufort West, where great things were soon to happen.
To any lover of trains, there can hardly be a sadder sight in all the world than this graveyard of memories. We're at Waar Junction, and it was here that construction on the line from Cape Town to Kimberley paused in that long, hot summer of 1883. By this time, the various pieces in Prime Minister Molteno's ambitious scheme were beginning to fuse together. And while we've been concentrating on Brownger's line, inching its way from Cape Town to the diamond fields of Kimberley, other hands have not been idle. Let's look at the map. This is a map of the time, and you can see just how far the railways in the Cape Colony had progressed by the year 1882. Kimberley, you'll notice, isn't even marked. It would be about here, I would say, 1,000 kilometres from Cape Town as the crow flies. But look at this. Look at what Port Elizabeth and East London have been up to while we've been watching Brownger. They've been pushing ahead too. The idea was to link up with Brownger's line somewhere about here on a wind-swept Karoo farm called Waar. And link up they did. On the 31st of March, 1884, 25 years to the day that Governor Sir George Grey had turned the first sod in Cape Town in the pouring rain. Now, the link-up was not without its drama. You see, in order to press ahead with construction, Brownger's people had recruited several hundred Zulus. They were encamped here at Waar. Now, as luck would have it, the labourers on the Midland line, coming up from Port Elizabeth to link up with Brownger's line here, these were Fingers, people who'd fled before Shaka's warriors into the land of the Xhosa. And naturally, there was no love lost between Fingers and Zulus. And so the coming confrontation was quite a reasonable recipe for disaster, and it was. Although they were accommodated in separate camps, they obviously weren't separate enough, because one day a dog from the Zulu side chased a buck through the Fingo camp, and all the Fingo dogs joined in. And when the buck was eventually killed, there were great arguments, and a white official had to be called in to arbitrate. Well, now, the Zulus didn't wait for his ruling. They just fell on the unsuspecting Fingers, and in a moment, 1,400 or so tribesmen were at each other's throats, and several were killed. Then, just before Christmas 1883, that is, the Fingers took their revenge. They fell on the warlike Zulus, and much to everybody's surprise, they gave them a real thrashing in a battle that left 60 dead. The army had to be called in to restore order. Then it was full speed ahead for Kimberley and the Diamonds.
As construction teams battled to link up the two lines at Waar, survey teams had reached the banks of the Orange River here. They decided to cross it only a few kilometers upstream from Hopetown, where less than 20 years before, 15-year-old Erasmus Jacobs had picked up that shiny pebble that was to change the face of South Africa. Ahead lay the greatest challenge that Brownger's engineers had been called upon to face. Spanning the Orange River. The bridge was to be 368 meters in length, in 9 spans of 40 meters, built of iron, of course, and every single bit of ironwork had to be shipped out from England.
To get their material to the other side of the river, they had to build a temporary bridge. One stormy day it was swept away. And then came a November day in 1884 when the spurs of steel reached almost to the banks of the Orange River here. Beyond the unfinished bridge, The way lay clear to Kimberley. But it might as well have been on the other side of the world, as far as the railways are concerned, because by this time the country was in the grip of a dire recession and there just wasn't the money to build the bridge. And so there it lay, a line to nowhere. And then, just as almost everybody had given up hope of it ever being completed, the British government stepped in and agreed to advance the money on one condition, that the work be completed within 8 months, that's to say by November 1885. That meant laying 120 kilometres of track in 240 days, and the bridge wasn't even completed. Could it be done? There was one man who reckoned it could be done. He was a man called George Pauling. Back in the year 1875, he'd arrived in Grahamstown from England, fresh from his training as a railway contractor under the famous Joseph Fairbank. He was just 21 years old, and his father was an engineer on the line from Wellington to Worcester. He'd been given an introduction to the resident engineer here, who made him the assistant engineer on the tunnel which was being built at a place known as Viehoek.
Now, it turned out that not only was Pauling a first-class engineer, but he had the makings of a very shrewd businessman as well. Because within no time at all, he'd wangled that tunnel contract for himself by the simple expedient of using someone else as a front. Now, he had no money at all, so he had to finance the first month's working by borrowing. And then he coaxed a local trader to open a store at the tunnel and give him a part of the profits. Well, the arrangement worked so well that within a month, he'd paid off the loan. By the time he was 24, Pauling was a rich man. He owned an ostrich farm, he owned a skating rink, and he owned the Masonic Hotel in Grahamstown. Now, his success was due not only to his skill as an engineer, but to his almost insatiable appetite for work. This is how he looked in later life, and his nickname was Georgie Porgy. He had the frame of an athlete and the strength of an ox. And one of his favorite party pieces was to pick up a pony, or it may have been a donkey, and carry this poor, unfortunate animal round and round the billiard room in his hotel. He also had a monumental thirst, and he loved to boast of the occasion when he and 2 other companions polished off 300 bottles of beer in the space of 24 hours. He was the sort of man of whom it said, "The impossible we do today. Miracles take a little longer." Anyway, he started construction work on the 24th of March and pressed on with all speed, despite the fact that the iron girders for the bridge didn't start to arrive till May. But then one day, the bridge was ready. And on the 27th of June, 1885, the first train puffed proudly across the Orange River. Because the rails and sleepers didn't arrive from England until the end of June, Pauling had 5 months, 150 days, to lay the 120 kilometres of track to Kimberley to save his contract. Now that meant laying at the rate of almost a kilometre a day. Could it be done? Well, Pauling reckoned it could. And so on he pressed, full speed ahead. July melted into August, 3 months to go. In a furious burst of speed, he laid 39 kilometres of track in 30 days. September came and went. He laid 14.5 kilometres in the space of a single week. Then November was upon him, and the line not finished yet. But in the end, it was done. And on a November day in 1885, with only a couple of days to spare, the first train puffed into Kimberley. Pauling had done it. For the people of Kimberley, the arrival of that train seemed to signal the start of a new era, and celebrations went on well into the night. Meanwhile, a young Scotsman, with his pockets full of money, arrived at a lonely halt on the western edge of the Great Karoo, where the only thing to mark its presence was a solitary iron hut shimmering in the noonday heat. His name was James Douglas Logan, and he'd arrived penniless in South Africa some 7 years before. At first he was the station master on the new Cape Town station, and then he was promoted to district superintendent on the Toes River Prince Albert section on the edge of the Great Plain.
He was so fascinated by the wilderness of the Karoo that he retired from the railways and bought a hotel at Toes River. Things went so well for him that in no time at all, he was the owner of a 50,000-hectare farm near the lonely halt called Maatjiesfontein. And this is what he did. He created this oasis in the desert. In the vast emptiness of the Karoo, he built the village we still call Maatjiesfontein.
The next thing Logan did was to wangle a contract for a whole string of refreshment rooms at stations on the line to Kimberley. Now, the passengers must have blessed him for this, because by all accounts, the trip from Cape Town was really tough going. It was very difficult to get anything to eat or to drink. There were no lavatories, no place to wash. You even had to sleep sitting up. But at this point, I think we should remind ourselves that the line from Cape Town to Kimberley was not the only one. It had been joined at De Aar by the line from Port Elizabeth as part of Prime Minister Maltino's ambitious scheme to link together the colony's main centres. You see, ever since the late 1850s, Port Elizabeth had been clamouring for a line to Uitenhage and the important farming centre of Graafrenet. But railways cost money, and money on that scale was simply not forthcoming.
And so, day after day, the wagons rolled inland carrying stores and equipment for the diamond mines. Some of the fortune seekers from Europe preferred to disembark at Cape Town as being the nearest landfall and face the nightmarish journey across the Karoo, but others preferred an extra week at sea for the sake of the shorter but hideously uncomfortable coach trip from Port Elizabeth. But for them at least, there were compensations for the 7 or 8 exhausting days on the road, and that was a glimpse of some of the most breathtaking scenery in all Africa.
One hot January day in 1872, the year the Cape Colony was granted self-government, everyone was agog with excitement, because the governor, Sir Henry Berkeley, was about to turn the first sod of the first railway in the Eastern Cape. It was part of Maltino's grand plan, but actually it was the local merchants that put up the money. Now, this should have signalled the start of a golden era of railways in the Eastern Cape, but right from the start, it ran into trouble. And once again, the problem was labour. You see, there just weren't enough white navvies to do the job, or convicts for that matter. So they decided to use the local Fingos. Now, as we saw earlier, Fingos were people who'd fled into Xhosa territory from the warlike Zulus during Shaka's reign and were looked upon by the Xhosas as slaves and dogs. So there was little love lost between them. So while Browninger pushed ahead with his 3-foot-6 gauge line from Wellington to Worcester, in our modern terms, of course, that would be 106.5 centimetres, Port Elizabeth's privately owned line to Uitenhage began to reach out from the coast with Fingo labour, using the same gauge. But before it actually reached Uitenhage, it was taken over by the Cape government. And according to all reports, the opening ceremony was quite something. The colony's Commissioner of Crown Lands and Public Works came along to the ceremony. He was John X. Merriman, and he'd come all the way from Cape Town. As luck would have it, he took great exception to one of the speeches, and said so in no uncertain terms.
This upset his audience so much that someone threw a souffle at him and forgot to remove it from its glass bowl. It hit him full in the face, and he beat a hasty retreat. Incidentally, it was at Uitenhage station that a railway legend was born. The signalman there was a man named James Edwin Wyde. He'd been a guard on the railways until he fell under the wheels of a train and lost both his legs. One day, he bought a young baboon and named it Jack. And in course of time, Jack the baboon learnt to operate the heavy signal levers. According to a local newspaper, he used to put down the lever, look around to see if the signal went up, and then gravely watch the train approach. And as the story goes, he even passed an official inspection. It took them 5 years to complete the line from Uitenhage to Graafrenet, so it wasn't until the end of August 1879 that the first train steamed into the station.
So Port Elizabeth had got what it had been campaigning for all those years, a link with the hinterland. The Midland Line, they called it, and this is Port Elizabeth Station today. Oddly enough, it was on a section of this line that Paul Kruger had his first experience of a train. The year was 1877, and he and his colleagues were on their way to Port Elizabeth to take ship to England to protest against the annexation of the Transvaal. None of them had ever been in a train before, so it must have been a most bewildering experience. Now, the story goes that the thing that really puzzled them was how the engine could turn without a disselboom. Now, that's the story. I think it's a pretty tall one myself. But anyway, this line from Port Elizabeth to Graafrenet was just one part of Maltino's grand plan to link the frontier towns together. And so, in 1873, we'd have found Maltino in East London cutting the first sod there for a line to King Williamstown and Queenstown. As it happened, much of the country through which the line from East London would pass on its way to Queenstown had been the scene of fierce fighting during the several frontier wars against the Xhosa. In fact, it was still in a very unsettled state, and so the authorities were only too anxious to get the line through as quickly as possible. But once again, labour was the problem. They had managed to rope in about 100 British navvies. Then they decided to have a go at recruiting the local Xhosas, raw as they were. After all, it had worked on the Midland Line with a finger, so why not give it a try? So they sent a recruiting agent to see what success he might have with the local chief of the Geiker tribe. Now, this chief's name was Sandile, and the British navvies must surely have found in him a kindred spirit, for he was extremely fond of the bottle. This habit must have been going back for years, because way back in 1852, the artist Thomas Baines had made this painting of him at a military canteen. The outcome of the meeting was that Sandile didn't or wouldn't grasp what was wanted, so nothing was decided. Anyway, a few days later, when the construction gang was at work, one of them happened to look up. And all round them were several hundred armed warriors, their red blankets standing out like blood against the sky. And as they advanced, with assegais and spears at the ready, the British navvies thought their last day had come. At their head was Sandile, not in the skins and plumes of a tribal warrior, but in a European shirt, a pair of narrow trousers, and an old billycock hat on his head. He was very, very drunk. But the show of force, obviously, was merely intended to impress, because he seemed quite prepared to listen to what the white men wanted to say. Then he started to haggle. He wanted an allowance, he said, for every man recruited. He wanted food, he wanted clothing, he wanted tobacco, and above all, he wanted brandy. And in the end, he agreed to let some of his warriors go. Then he asked for some of the manure that would be left behind by this strange wagon. Now, when it came to construction, of course, none of his men had ever seen a spade before. So you can imagine the problems in training them. Yet, in spite of all these difficulties, on the 27th of March, 1877, the first train puffed into King Williamstown, and the people went wild with enthusiasm. And now it was full steam ahead for Queenstown. Then, one cold September morning, the navvies woke up and listened. That's funny, they said. It's very quiet. So they jumped up and had a look. And there was not a single black man to be seen anywhere in the camp. Every labourer had vanished, even the cooks had fled. So what had happened? Well, the answer wasn't very long in coming, because around about noon, one of those pump-handled inspection trolleys trundled up the line, and the news it brought was bad. The 9th Frontier War had begun. Naturally, the war put paid to construction until such time as soldiers were brought in to guard the camps, and then it was full speed ahead as usual. But the going was getting harder. There were steeper gradients and sharper curves to contend with. By this time, and we're talking of May 1880, Brownger's line had reached Beaufort West. There was also a line from Port Elizabeth to Grahamstown, where Pauling had started his remarkable career.
Although Grahamstown was now linked by rail to Port Elizabeth, the city fathers had never given up hope of a line to Port Alfred at the mouth of the Cowie River. For years, they'd dreamt of transforming the tiny harbour there into the principal port of the Eastern Cape, and so wrest the lucrative trade from its rival, Port Elizabeth. So you can imagine the surprise and the jubilation when the government suddenly announced that it would give £50,000 to anyone who'd build that line. Well, that was just the sort of challenge that appealed to Pauling, and he went at it like a terrier at a rat. In no time at all, he had all the facts and figures at his fingertips. He got a photograph of the Cowie River with about 12 vessels lying at the wharves. It looked very busy, and nobody was to know that they were rather small vessels. But it gave the impression of a busy commercial river. Then he had the photograph blown up to about 6 feet, and he trotted off to London to raise the necessary funds, and the upshot was that the Grahamstown and Port Elizabeth Railway Company was floated with a capital of £200,000. So Grahamstown's dream of having a seaport of its own was about to come true.
Only one real problem faced the experienced Pauling on this project, and that was the river at Blowcrans. The plan was to build a high-level bridge over the ravine at a height of anything up to 80 meters above the river. As usual, all the ironwork had to be imported from Europe, and some sections were either lost overboard or were damaged. But despite all this, by October 1884, Pauling had erected the bridge and opened it to traffic. The line went from one financial crisis to another, until one dreadful Saturday afternoon in 1911, when a message came flashing along the wires. A train had plunged over the bridge, and 29 people had been killed on the jagged rocks below. For the Cowie Railway Company, it was the end of the line, a blow from which they were never to recover. One winter's afternoon, during those turbulent days of the late 1830s, a party of trekkers outspanned under this 1,000-year-old fig tree, not very far from the banks of the Arpes River. Their leader was Andries Hendrik Potgieter, and he was taking his people north to the distant Zoutpansberg. Now, Potgieter was a man of great vision, and he came up with an idea that convinced his followers that he was crazy. He dreamt, and remember this is the 1830s, he dreamt of a railway line from the Transvaal to the sea. 2 years later, he was negotiating with the Portuguese governor of Mozambique for a line from Delagoa Bay to the newly established seat of government at Potchefstroom. And this was barely 9 years since Stephenson rocket had made that epic journey from Manchester to Liverpool. In the end, of course, nothing came of Potgieter's dreams. But had he been able to go ahead, one wonders how different our history might have been. Not far from here, a town sprang up that was in time to become the capital of the Transvaal Republic. They called it Pretoria. And one day in the summer of 1874, one would have found Thomas Francois Burgers.
The energetic president of the Transvaal Republic, using all his eloquence and persuasion to bring members of the Volksraad around to his way of thinking on a project that was far in advance of the views of his people at that time.
The subject under discussion, as you probably guessed, was a railway. You see, like Potgieter before him, Burgers was convinced that Delagoa Bay was the natural port for the Transvaal, and that having a railway outlet there would avoid goods from overseas having to be carted through either one or other of the two British colonies at exorbitant rates. Well, his eloquence and his enthusiasm eventually won the day, and with the blessing of the majority of the Volksraad, he was soon on his way to Holland, where he hoped to raise the equivalent of 600,000 rands, which was 4 times the Transvaal's annual budget. He sailed from Cape Town well enough prepared, tucked away in his baggage with samples of every mineral he could lay hands on. There was gold, of course, there was cobalt, there was iron, there was tin, there was copper, even a bit of coal. And with these, he hoped to persuade would-be investors of the treasure trove of minerals in the Transvaal just waiting to be exploited. Although his bubbling enthusiasm was infectious, he failed to persuade the hard-headed moneylenders of Amsterdam. And so with weary feet, he trod the city streets. And in the end, the best deal he could manage was a complicated debenture issue to be repaid by installments on the basis of all unlikely things, of a lottery. Although this produced only about a quarter of what was needed, it was better than nothing, and he straightway spent most of it on railway equipment. But when he got back home, he found the Republic in such deep financial trouble that he had to abandon his dreams. And most of that expensive equipment was left to rust on the shores of Delagoa Bay. But let's leave the Transvaal and its problems for a moment and take a look at what was happening to the East London line, which was making its way north from Queenstown to the Orange River. Ahead loomed this great mountain barrier, the Stormberg, towering more than 1,800 meters above the sea. Here was a mighty challenge, even more formidable than the one tackled in the Hex River Kloof a few years before. Who would accept the challenge? Well, there was always one man who was prepared to give it a bash. He, of course, was George Pauling. He began construction at Sterkstroom, where the ground starts to rise to the Stormberg Plateau. And he cut, and he bridged, and he wound his way around mountain peaks. And in September 1884, he reached the little village of Maltino. And here, at 1,600 meters above sea level, up in the clouds where the storms are brewed, someone had discovered coal, so vital now to any railway.
Pauling was over the watershed and into the valleys. He cut embankments, he bridged rivers, he wound his way down to Burgersdorp to reach at last the banks of the Orange River at Aliwal North. That done, he was off hot foot to the site of the Orange River Bridge to start that fantastic dash to Kimberley, which he reached in November 1885.
Yet, as Christmas 1885 approached, and the wealthy merchants weighed their precious diamonds and counted out their gold sovereigns, fate had a surprise in store. Because in a few short months, on a lonely Transvaal farm, a man was to discover gold. We've come a long way since that winter's day in 1886, when George Harrison, out for an afternoon stroll, stumbled on a bit of outcropped reef that was to spark an industrial explosion and to spawn a mushrooming, money-mad metropolis called Johannesburg, virtually on Pretoria's doorstep. At once, the focus of world attention swung from Britain's Cape Colony to Paul Kruger's Boer Republic, and all eyes turned on Johannesburg, a town that wasn't even on the map, and yet it was to become the largest city in the world ever built so far from any waterway. So, in the old days, how on earth did you get here? Well, you could take ship to one of the Cape ports, and from there by train to Kimberley or Colesberg or even Allowell North. Now, if you're in a hurry, and who wasn't, of course the quickest way was from Cape Town to Kimberley. And from there, if you could afford it, by fast coach to Pretoria. Now that would take you and the other 14 passengers 3.5 days over wretched roads. And then you'd still have to face another 3.5 hours from Pretoria to Johannesburg, provided the Yukske River wasn't in flood and the drift impassable. Now, if you didn't have that sort of money, you could always go by ox wagon or simply walk. One May morning in the year 1860, that's to say just 9 months after Driver Dabbs and his famous engine landed in Cape Town, a 24-horsepower contractor's locomotive was landed in packing cases at Durban Harbour and reassembled in a shed near the Market Square by a man named Henry Jacobs.
1 month later, on a bright and blustery Saturday afternoon, a special train with the acting governor on board, company bigwigs, engineers and other dignitaries, and the chairman and directors on the footplate went puffing out of the station on its 5-minute journey to the point. You see, although the Cape Town to Wellington line had had a head start, the contractor there had dragged his heels so much that the honour of becoming the first passenger train to operate south of Cairo fell not to the Cape, as everybody expected, but to Natal. It was at once an impressive and never-to-be-forgotten moment.
A century and a half ago, Hendrik Potgieter dreamt of a rail link to the sea at Delagoa Bay. 40 years later, President Burgers had the same idea. But it was left to President Paul Kruger to make that dream a reality. 3 years before Johannesburg was born, he'd succeeded in persuading financiers in Holland to put up the money for a line to the Portuguese border. At the same time, the Portuguese entrusted their concession for the line from Delagoa Bay to the Transvaal border to an American financier named Edward McMurdo. Naturally, that started the Transvaalers thinking, because what if McMurdo were to raise his finance in London? That would mean that the Republic's precious railroad would have to link to a section built by the British, and that was the last thing that Kruger wanted. Well, in the end, that's just what McMurdo did. In spite of all his promises, he sold his concession to a company in London. And for Kruger and his colleagues, that was a bitter blow. A century ago, the so-called port of Delagoa Bay, now Maputo, where Kruger's line was due to start, was little more than a collection of sand-swept hovels seething with malaria on the edge of a stinking swamp. And thanks to McMurdo's wheeling and dealing, the builders on this section would now be British. All told, 200 white men and 3,000 blacks went to work on the Portuguese section of the line as it headed towards the Transvaal border, 88 kilometers away. Before 6 months were out, they were going to be dropping like swatted flies from fever, and 200 of them would die. But still, despite all this, the day arrived when the line was so nearly finished that the chief engineer, who of course was British, decided that the time had come for a little celebration. And so he organized a sumptuous picnic banquet round about the Transvaal border, and he invited all the local bigwigs.
To take them there, he laid on a special train decorated with flags and bunting. He even had a priest to sprinkle the little engine with holy water. Now, all the food and drink for the banquet was in a second train due to follow a little later, and the waiters as well. However, long after the speechifying had ended, and stomachs were starting to rumble and tongues were parched, there was still no sign of the food train. Eventually, when it did arrive, several hours late, the trucks were bare. Some of the British navvies had hijacked the train and polished off the lot, all the food and liquor. And to rub salt in the wound, they sent the chief engineer a message to say that they duly drunk his health in his own precious wine.
On Christmas Day, 1887, the Portuguese section of the line had reached the border. The way was clear to carry the line forward to Pretoria. Now, President Kruger had granted the concession to build and operate railways within his republic to a Netherlands company, the Nederlandse Zuid-Afrikaanse Spoorweg Maatschappij, better known as ZASM. And their first step was to establish their main base at Komatipoort, a hot and squalid camp, as someone once wrote about it, cursed by scorching sun all day and a myriad mosquitoes all night. In no time at all, the Komatipoort camp had collected a colourful assortment of saloon keepers, gamblers, con men, highway robbers, petty thieves, and other undesirables. Malaria, of course, was rampant, and it spared no one. Hollanders, full-blooded and fresh from Europe, were always early victims. Your chance of survival was less than 1 in 7. A corpse under every sleeper was the way they put it. So here they lie, their only headstone, a bushveld tree, or the waving grass.
Zeer stille wateren. Hij verkwikt mijn ziel. Hij leidt mij in het spoor der gerechtigheid om zijns naams wil. Al ging ik ook in een dal der schaduw des doods, ik zou geen kwaad vrezen.
Early one summer's morning, the old president was sitting on his stoop here, sipping his usual cup of coffee, when a visitor arrived. He was George Pauling, and he'd come to ask the president for more railway contracts. Well, it so happened that some years before, when Kruger and his colleagues were on their way back from an abortive visit to London, no hotel in the Cape would accommodate them. Well, one evening, a railway official came upon Kruger and his colleagues, this party of his, more or less dossing down on the platform at Kraankale station, and he offered them the use of his office to spend the night. Now, that railway official was George Pauling's brother Frank, And Kruger never forgot that act of kindness, and he told Pauling he could have any contract he wanted. Now, the contract that Pauling wanted more than any other was that section of Kruger's line from the border at Komatipoort to where it was poised at the entrance to the formidable and infamous Crocodile Poort. It was one of the most awesome engineering projects ever attempted in South Africa. And if any man could do it, that man was George Pauling. But before he could break out from the flat bushveld to the fertile lands above, he had first to master this gorge where the mercury could soar to 40 degrees and more. And no man was spared the deadly fever, nor any beast the ravages of the tsetse fly. In just 10 months, Pauling lost more than 100 men and 500 donkeys. Yet in spite of the hazards, he and his men eventually burst out of the gorge into a lush, fertile but fever-infested valley where Nelspruit stands today.
Then came another climb, and soon the line was twisting and turning and wiggling along the valley of the Elands River. In just 65 kilometers, it rose 500 meters until it reached the final hurdle, where the cool Highveld unlooses its cascading waterfall over the escarpment. The land tumbles into the hot valley below. I wonder how often they must have stood here and gazed up at the edge of that great escarpment, wondered how they could bridge the gap that stood between them and the cool breezes of the Highveld over 200 meters above. They began by cutting through solid rock for a whole kilometer. And then they drove this tunnel 213 meters and working from both ends to emerge eventually on the Highveld plain at Watervalboven, a rise of 1,500 meters from where the line had begun at Delagoa Bay 7 years before.
To cope with the steep gradient, they built a 4-kilometer rack railway that used a special engine. That's how they finally reached the Highveld plain. The rest of the way to Pretoria was more or less plain sailing. So there were 3 railroad concerns, all panting to be first at the Witwatersrand goldfields. The Cape tentacles stretched as far as Kimberley, Aliwal North and Colesberg, and the Natal line from Durban was crawling through the mountains towards the frontier. And so began a race that in concept, if not in scale, rivaled the dash across the mountains and prairies of America for the railroad giants there more than 20 years earlier. Country, however, there was a snag, and it was this. Before any line from the Cape could reach the Transvaal, it must first cross the Republic of the Orange Free State, and the farmers there made their feelings very clear to President Brunt. No railway.
He said, "You may not agree with me now, But our children will convey all their goods and produce by train, and they will fly through the air in machines like birds. Now, he said that in 1888, 14 years before the Wright brothers took to the air in what was to be the first powered flight in history. It was unlikely that a man of the vision of President Brunt would hold up progress, and by 1889 he'd given the green light for the Cape lines to cross the Free State to the Transvaal border. The upshot was that by Christmas 1890, a train from Colesberg was steaming into Bloemfontein. Naturally, this railhead put Kruger in a quandary. He'd planned, you see, to keep the lines from the Cape and Natal at arm's length until his own line from Delagoa Bay reached the Witwatersrand. He felt that he owed it to all those who'd invested in the railway to give it a good 6-month start. But as the days went by, he found it more and more difficult to refuse the gold mines a rail outlet to the sea. So, in June 1890, Kruger made up his mind. The Cape could carry its railway forward from Bloemfontein to the Transvaal border at Viljoensdrift on the Verhaal, but the rail link from there to Johannesburg would have to be built with the Netherlands-South Africa Railway Company. Enter now Cecil John Rhodes, Prime Minister of the Cape and Chairman of De Beers. Rhodes looked at the map, then he looked at the railways, then he had an idea. What about a railway to Rhodesia? What about a great ribbon of steel stretching all the way to Cairo? But before he could even think of Cairo, he had to win the race to Johannesburg first. So he called in the long-suffering Pauling. And Pauling, in a feat of construction unparalleled up to that time, laid the 335 kilometers of track from Bloemfontein to the Vaal River in just 212 days.
To the south, the Natal line had already left the coal deposits of Newcastle behind and was pressing on through the mountain passes towards the Transvaal frontier. To the east, the Netherlands-South Africa Company line from Delagoa Bay was underway at last, heading for Pretoria. And until it was completed, Kruger was determined to keep the Cape and Natal lines out of the Republic at all costs.
Then fate took a hand, because one day came the news that the Delagoa line had run out of money and had come to a standstill at Nelspruit. Kruger sat and pondered. What could he do? The line on which he staked absolutely everything was bankrupt. What could he do? Then, ironically, it was Rhodes and the Cape government that came to the rescue and bailed him out, on condition that the Cape would carry their line forward to Johannesburg over a bridge built by the Netherlands Company.
Kruger turned up for the opening, and so did Francis William Rates, the new president of the Free State.
And that's how the Cape Government Railways won the race to Johannesburg, because at 11 minutes to 12, on the 15th of September 1892, a train from Cape Town steamed into Johannesburg. The journey had taken 2 days, 14 hours and 17 minutes. Sadly for Kruger, it was to be another 2 years before his line from Delagoa Bay, the Zazen line, was to reach Pretoria. And it wasn't until the 15th of December 1895 that the Natal line reached the goldfields. Kruger had held it up at the border for 4 weary years. So, by Christmas Day of that year, all the important centres in South Africa were linked together, and for the moment, it seemed as if the barometer for the Boer republics and the British colonies was set at fair, at last.